In the last section, we spoke a little bit about how we create Flutter applications. So remember, you and I are going to be creating a bunch of widgets, and then we assemble them together to get our desired application. In general, there's a tremendous number of widgets included with Flutter that we can leverage to build some really interesting applications quite quickly. In this section, we'll continue by talking about the first application we're going to be putting together. So let's take a look at a mockup. Okay, so here's the general idea. We're going to build an application that will show a list of images to our users. When a user first boots up our application, we'll show them the screen over here at the left-hand side. So by default, nothing is displayed on the screen. There's going to be a button at the bottom right-hand side, and if a user presses on this thing, then we will show a single image to the user, like what you see here in the middle. We'll show the image, and then right underneath it, we'll show some relevant title for the image as well. If a user then presses on this button again, we're going to add another image to that list. And then for however many times the user presses this button, we're going to add an additional image each and every time. So along the process, we're going to learn quite a bit about handling images, we're going to learn about building lists, and we're also going to learn a little bit about fetching data off the internet. Because the list of images that we're going to display here are not going to be saved on our hard drive or anything like that. We're going to instead fetch a list of images off the internet. And then every time a user presses a button, we'll show an additional image that we have fetched. Okay, so that's the general idea. There's definitely going to be a good set of challenges inside of here. So let's continue, but before we do, let's make sure that we start up our emulator and make sure that we're all ready to start working on this application. So I'm going to make sure that I'm inside of my pics directory, which is the name of the project we just generated. And then inside this, I'm going to run flutter run, like so. And then I should see my application appear inside my emulator very shortly. All right, so I'm going to let that do its startup, and then we'll come back in the next section, and we'll talk about how we're going to build this application. At the end of the last section, we started up our sample application inside of our emulator. So now you should see the default counter application that tells you how many times you've pressed some given button, and you can click on the button and see that count increment. Now I've taken the liberty of also starting up my code editor inside that pics directory as well. And so I encourage you to pause the video right now and make sure you start up your code editor too. Once you get your code editor open, you're going to find a collection of different files and folders inside of our pics directory. We're going to start to explore some of these different files and folders over time, but for right now, we're going to be 100% focused on exactly one very specific folder, and that is the lib directory. So 99% of all the code that you and I write to build Flutter applications is going to be placed inside of this lib directory. Every lib directory that you're going to work with is always going to have a main.dart file inside of it. The main.dart file is very special. It's the first file that gets loaded up and executed when our application is ran inside of our mobile device. So we need to make sure that we always have one file called main.dart inside the lib directory. Now we can certainly have other files inside of here as well, but at a minimum, we have to have a main.dart file. If you now open up this file, you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of code already inside of here. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to learn things from scratch, and I don't really like using a lot of pre-generated code. So rather than trying to work with all this stuff, I'm going to highlight all that code and delete it, like so. So we'll start completely fresh, and we'll get a really good idea of how to build up an application from scratch. Now, I'm sure you're very excited to get started on this application right here, but there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve to get to this point. So rather than trying to just beeline fetching some images and showing them on the screen, I think we should set a little bit more realistic short-term goal. Let's say that for right now, we'll just try to get some very plain content to appear on the screen of our device. So on the screen of our emulator over here. In other words, let's just try to get some very plain text to show up. So in order to get some text to show up, I'm going to go back over to my main.dart file, and then inside of here, I'm going to lay out a couple of comments that are going to guide me through the process of getting some content to appear on the screen. So I'm going to lay out 4 separate comments that are going to walk us through exactly what we have to do. At the very top, I'm going to add a comment that says that I need to import a helper library from Flutter to get content on the screen. So that's going to be step 1. We're going to have to import some code into our project. And we'll talk exactly about what an import statement is doing for us in just a moment. But first, let's continue on with a couple more comments. So the second thing we need to do is define a main function to run when our app starts. So just as before, back inside of Dartpad, where we said we have to define a main function, which is the first function that gets ran inside of our program, same is true as of Flutter as well. So every Flutter app that we build is always going to have exactly one main function defined inside of it. And that main function will be executed for us automatically. Then inside of that main function, we're going to do two additional steps. First, we're going to create a new text widget to show some text on the screen. And then finally, we're going to take that widget and get it on the screen. So creating the text widget, or creating something that's going to show some information on the screen, is a slightly different process than actually taking that thing and telling our mobile device to put it on the screen. Two separate things. On the one hand, we have to first create the widget, and then the second step is to actually get it on the screen of our device. Okay, so that's the 4 steps that we're going to go through. So let's take a pause right here. We'll come back in the next section, and we're going to start on these 4 steps.